Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our monthly computational social science webinar organized by our computational social science lab at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I'm Hai Liang, an associate professor of communication. So today we are very, very happy to have Professor Joshua Jackson. So first, let me briefly introduce Professor Jackson. He's an assistant professor of behavioral science at the University of Chicago's Business School. He's a world-renowned social psychologist and did a lot of great. And also from my own reading, it's super interesting studies about how culture has shaped the mind throughout human history and how it continues to shape human futures. He's also a methodology innovator. He has developed new computational methods like how to using natural language processing to study cognition and culture. So we are very, very privileged to have him here today to share his insights. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Jackson. And also during the talk, please feel free to post your question in the chat box. So we will check it and we will have a Q&A session formally after Professor Jackson's presentation. Okay, so Professor Jackson, so your time.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for the really kind introduction. I hope everyone can see the screen and hear me okay. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak to a really interdisciplinary group of people who have probably done research on some of the same topics that I'll be speaking about, and I'm especially looking forward to the Q&A session to have some discussion about this stuff. I'm going to speak about the history of our minds today, and especially how our moral psychology may have changed over the last few hundred or even a few tens of years, and how it might be changing in the future. And I think a good place to start this talk would be just to speak about one of the independent variables of this research program, which is the size of our social networks. It's a topic that I'm going to be revisiting a lot. And this is not something that I really need to tell this group, but it is enormous. It's incredible how enormous our social networks are today. 500 million people log into Twitter every month. We work in organizations where single buildings can house 10,000 people, like Apple Park in California. And single cities can have millions of people in it, 7 million people who live in Hong Kong. And when I think about the size of these social networks, I actually think about my grandfather, who was one of the first police officers to arrive from the United Kingdom to New Zealand. My great-grandfather, he arrived right at the beginning of the 20th century in 1903 from Yorkshire, and he moved to this little town that you see here on this in this slide. So this is Inglewood, New Zealand, which is in the Taranaki region. Every single person that he met during his time in New Zealand came to his funeral, about 300 people. I probably interact with more people than that just in a single week. There are almost as many people as that on this Zoom call right now. And when I think about the difference between our lives, his life about 100 years ago and then my life now, it's sort of a recapitulation of how social networks have changed throughout history. Evolutionary anthropologists have done studies of the different parts of culture that you can map out, from infrastructure to money to government to hierarchy to writing systems that groups have. And they find that all of these different parts of culture tend to co-evolve together into a construct they call social complexity, which is just how complicated culture is. Turns out that when groups develop writing systems, they also tend to develop government systems that have hierarchies. They also tend to develop urbanized settlements and agricultural ways of growing food. And what's happened to all of these indicators over history is they've all gone up. So every single world region has gotten more socially complex over time, without exception. And you can think about this as a kind of macro level playing out of what's happened between my great-grandfather and myself. Today, I'm going to be speaking about some of the challenges of this cultural evolution, and specifically the challenges associated with individual people who want to find trustworthy partners in a very complex world where they don't really know any of the people around them. But also the challenges for groups that want to maintain cooperation amongst societies that have thousands or millions of people, many of whom don't have any reason to cooperate with each other or to support the social institutions that need to be maintained for the group to survive. And the approach that I'm going to take to talk about how we solve these challenges is an evolutionary approach. I'm going to be speaking about how human culture and psychology has evolved to meet the challenges of social complexity. And before I get into the gory details of the studies that I'm going to share, I just want to speak a little bit about this evolutionary approach, because when some people, hear that word evolution, they think, well, this is in the purview of biology. It's not something that should be applied to culture or psychology. My colleagues and I have argued that that isn't the case, that actually evolutionary models are very useful for thinking about culture and human behavior. This is a society that we started a few years ago that now has biannual meetings where we discuss cultural evolution. And I highly encourage you to look into it if you're interested in meeting like-minded folks, if this is a topic you're curious about. Usually when I explain cultural evolution to people, I just lay out the three principles of Darwinian evolution and show how easily they apply to culture. So the first principle of Darwinian evolution is that entities in a population vary in their characteristics. This is clearly true of culture. Almost every facet of culture is tremendously diverse around the world. The second principle is that entities have different rates of survival and reproduction or competition, which Darwin called this struggle for existence. So you can see this in the forms of culture that evolve, both in our material artifacts like the wheel or sporks. These are both material artifacts that became popular and spread around the world because they were useful, because they survived this struggle for existence. But you can also see it in more abstract forms of culture, like language. All of these words are competing with one another for usage and attention. When a word gets used more, it's thriving in this struggle for existence. And when words go out of style and die, you can think of it as a failure to reproduce. And so I'll speak a little bit about how we can understand these processes of word reproduction and reflect on how psychology may have changed by virtue of these linguistic trends. And then finally, there's this principle of inheritance, this idea that we pass culture along to the next generation, that we inherit culture across groups and across individuals. Usually when people think about inheritance, they think about these phylogenetic trees of species that are very common in biology, like this tree on the left. Darwin didn't actually draw any of these trees, but you can see him sort of thinking about them in his notebook. This is a sketch that people dug up after Darwin died. But little did people know that the reason that Darwin was thinking about trees so early is that he copied the idea from his friend August Schleicher, the linguist, who was at the time sketching out a language tree of Indo-European history. And Darwin was probably quite jealous of his friend because he actually knew what happened at the branches here. He knew the languages that could fill in the phylogeny, whereas Darwin just had to guess at what was at these branches. And of course, not only do people continue to use these phylogenetic trees of cultural history, but you can actually chart out cultural variation across them, and it tends to map quite nicely. And so this is a tree of countries by language history, and the nodes on this tree are shaded based on whether the country is above the median level of collectivism or above the median level of individualism on Hofstede's dimensions of collectivism, individualism, or below the median level. So you can see that the individualist countries group together in terms of their cultural ancestry, and the collectivist countries tend to group together, suggesting that this is a form of culture that can be passed down across generations as groups split off and migrate to other parts of the world. And so, today I'm going to be arguing that you can use an evolutionary approach to studying cultural trends and cultural changes. And it turns out that this argument is not very original. Actually, Darwin made this argument himself when he talked about a curious parallel between language and biology. I think that what I do in my research is I go a little bit further than Darwin did and a little bit further than other cultural evolutionists did, because what I suggest is that we can actually think about the processes that social psychologists study as products of cultural evolution. We can think about the emotions that we speak about, the religions that we hold, our beliefs about morality or love or personality or our political ideologies as products of cultural evolution, just like the artifacts that we use or the words that we use. And so when I think about this question of how we can overcome complexity and how we can find trust in large societies and large social networks, I'm speaking about it as an evolutionary challenge, and one that our genes are not necessarily meant to solve or ready to solve, something that we need culture for. Now, I could speak about how all of these different facets of psychology are adapted to this challenge, but today I'm going to focus on religion and morality because I think these are particularly relevant when we're speaking about how to deal with the problems of complexity. And the talk is going to go like this. I'm going to divide it up into 3 parts. The first is focusing on the rise of what I call generalized morality as a way for individual people to figure out who to trust and who not to trust in large social networks. The second is going to speak about the moralization of religion, the infiltration of morality into religious beliefs as a way of maintaining cooperation and order in really large societies. And then third, I'm going to give a kind of 2.0, which is going to speak about some more recent trends about the creep of morality into other kinds of social institutions and how that might be related to reductions in religion. Okay. So with that, I'll dive in. I'll speak a little bit about what I call generalized morality. And probably a good place to start is to talk about this man. I'm not sure if you know who this is. It's now been a few years, but this is Martin Shkreli. He became infamous several years ago, about 8 years ago now, because he raised the price of a very important medication from $13.50 a tablet to $750 a tablet overnight, because he had priced out that insurance companies that cover this would still pay for it. And it was a way for him to make a lot of money, but potentially to alienate people who didn't have insurance and wouldn't be able to pay for the medication otherwise. What's really interesting about this story is that when I heard of this, I and a lot of other people immediately thought that this was probably an awful person in many other ways. He's not just someone who would overprice a vital medication. He's probably also someone that would be romantically unfaithful. He probably isn't very loyal to his group. And he isn't probably a very responsible caregiver. If he had kids, he probably wouldn't be a very good parent. And it's interesting that I made all of these inferences just based on one piece of information. And often, these kinds of inferences wouldn't be justified. It turns out that for Martin Shkreli, they were justified because he was a pretty terrible person in all of these other ways. But this isn't just something that we do with Martin Shkreli. This is something that people do for a wide range of social targets. This is from a pilot study that I did when I was a graduate student, where people had to think of all of these different kinds of people, someone they admired, someone they respected, someone they disliked, someone they could mentor or learn from. They had to rate these people on these different attributes. And then what we did is we looked at the correlation between these attributes. So if someone said that a social target was compassionate, how did they rate their fairness or loyalty or respect or their virtue? And it turns out that people kind of treat these attributes as just synonyms, like they're all just the same thing. When we did a factor analysis, all of these attributes loaded on a single factor, like a single principal component, and there wasn't a single other factor that emerged as even close to meaningful. The reason that this is interesting is that it's not how the real world works. When you look at actual cooperation or actual morality, it's tremendously variable. This is something that we've known in psychology since a famous book called Personality and Assessment by Walter Mischel. And it's something that you find when you ask about people's cooperation in hypothetical vignettes, when you give people different kinds of economic games, when you look at real world behaviors like whether someone volunteers at a homeless shelter or donates blood. In the real world, these things are correlated at a very low level, about 0.1 to 0.25. And so what you can draw out is this spectrum of how you can think about morality. Morality is tremendously complicated, as varying across many different dimensions that are not that related to each other. Morality is somewhat complicated, kind of like moral foundations theory suggests that it is. as 5 dimensions, or morality is just one thing. People can be good or people can be bad, or somewhere in between along a single dimension. And what my pilot studies suggest is that in people's minds, morality looks like this far right triangle, whereas in reality, it looks like this far left triangle. This is actually something you can chart across history. These are words for these are frequencies of the word for morality in different languages. It turns out that the word morality is a fairly recent word. It actually comes from Cicero's translation of Aristotle's word ethikos, to mean ethics. And of course, ethics has a very different meaning than morality. What's happened is that after Cicero translated Aristotle's ethics, the word had a transformation in meaning over the next several hundred years to its present day meaning as this sort of indicator of generalized morality, whether something or someone is good or bad. And you can see during this transformation, the word morality is getting more popular in language. When you look at the popularity of the word compared to other words, what you see is that morality started off just 300 years ago as sort of similar to a lot of other more specific words that we might use, like caring or communal or lawful or loyal. But by the end of the 20th century, it was the most popular word about morality out of all of these. You see this dip here in moral in the 20th century, which I think is due to religious deconversion and secularization. But if you look at more secular versions of the concept of morality, like good person and bad person, these are still on the rise. So these are Google search trends for good person and bad person since 2000, when my last graph leaves off. And you can see that people are continually interested in whether they're a good person or whether someone else is a good person or a bad person. My colleagues and I have done research suggesting that what's happening here is that generalized morality is spreading in large social networks. As networks get bigger, people adopt an increasingly generalized view of morality, trading all of the complicated dimensions of moral character to just a single dimension of goodness or badness. And this is happening because there's this trade-off between accuracy and generalizability with how people perceive morality, and that as networks get bigger, people go from wanting accurate characteristics to generalizable characteristics. The logic goes like this. When you live in a small social network, you have a lot of information about people. You can look at all of these people in your social network and you'll know how they'll behave in almost every situation, whether they're going to be brave during conflict, whether they're going to be honest or deceptive, whether they'll be charitable, or whether they will withhold charity. But in a large social network, you just don't have that information. I might get 1 or 2 bits of information about any given person that I interact with. And what generalized morality does is it allows me to extrapolate from that one little bit of information in one situation and to make broad predictions about how someone will behave in every situation. Now, of course, my predictions aren't always going to be right because there is meaningful variation. But from a computational perspective, as long as there's a sufficient correlation across situations, at some point it will become more advantageous to average across situations than to make no assumptions about some novel behavior in a different situation that you haven't observed yet. And in this sense, you can think about generalized morality as something that the psychologist Gerd Gittgrenzer calls an adaptive heuristic. It's exploiting the structure of the situation, these large anonymous social networks, to best divine when someone might cooperate or defect. Now, we've done some studies of this that I'll briefly describe before moving on. Some of these studies are actually showing that from a computational perspective, from a modeling perspective, that this is an adaptive strategy in large social networks. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into these, but you'll have to read the paper to see these interesting simulations and experiments. But I will talk about some of the studies that we did to test the other hypotheses. And one of the hypotheses that was generated from our theory is that generalized morality, people's endorsement of generalized morality, should correlate with social network size. So in big social networks, people should show the most generalized morality. One of the contexts where we tested this hypothesis was using field data in the Tanzanian Hadza hunter-gatherers, one of the few communities of the world that still lives primarily using hunting and gathering. But of course, this is changing really rapidly because Hadza hunter-gatherers are being visited by tourists, and some of them are going into nearby cities to work and go to school. And so what you have is you have this really eclectic melting pot in Hadza hunter-gatherer communities, where in some camps, people will know Swahili, they'll have got a formal education, they'll know who Barack Obama is. But in other camps, people won't have any of that information. And it tends to correlate because when people in a camp, when one person goes into the city, they tend to get a lot of other kinds of exposure to larger social networks and foreign cultures. So what we did is we created this out-of-camp exposure index by asking people about these kinds of qualities, whether they had been outside of the camp and experienced life in nearby cities and nearby institutions. And then we asked them about the morality of their campmates. And what we wanted to see was whether people who'd been outside of camps used more generalized morality when they were trying to characterize their campmates than people who had stayed in their camps, even controlling for how well they knew their campmates. So this is an example of someone who shows total generalized morality. They've rated their campmate 2 as the most honest, the most generous, the most effortful, and having the best heart. These are rankings, so 1 is the best. And then this is what they would look like for generalized morality for every campmate. If someone is the 4th most honest, they are also the 4th most on all of these other characteristics. Someone who looks more localized would look like this. They recognize that these traits are actually dissociable, that just because someone's honest, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the most generous. What we found in our study is that people who had more out-of-camp exposure, that had lived in cities more, had a lower standard deviation of attributes across these rankings. The rankings always correlated with one another, which you can see here. If a circle is blue, there's a positive correlation, and all the circles are blue, and you can see the correlations down here. So people who were rated as honest were always rated as more generous. But the size of these correlations was significantly larger for people who'd been outside of their camp and who had interacted in cities. And this was constant when we controlled for the age of the participants, when we controlled for their gender, and whether we controlled for whether they were rating a family member and the characteristics of the person they were rating. And you can see the same thing in survey data, which is a little more straightforward. So in some surveys, both cross-cultural and also across the United States, we just asked people, rather than getting their perceptions of their partners, we just asked people about whether they agreed with generalized morality, whether everyone has a good or bad basic character, or whether all goodness and badness can be traced back to one dimension of morality. And we also looked at their social network size via how many friends they had on Facebook, if they had Facebook, and also how many people they interacted with on a daily basis, whether they were more like my great-grandfather or more like me. And what we found is that in all of these samples, the larger that someone's social network was, the more that they endorsed generalized morality, regardless of the sample, whether it was international or across the US, and regardless of the measure of social network size. And when we controlled for SES, age, gender, religiosity, education, and country fixed effects, 3 of these 4 relationships remain statistically significant. And so that was some evidence that generalized morality correlates with social network size. We've also done historical analyses, seeing whether generalized morality has become more prevalent throughout history. So I've already argued that it has using some frequency data, but there are many reasons that words can get more or less frequent. And so another approach that you can take is looking at the semantic space of morality. And so one way that you can visualize morality and our moral semantics is this space where words that are near each other are closer together in meaning. And if we think about morality as having these different dimensions, then we can think about these words as clustering together into distinct modular clusters. Like these are words about loyalty, and these are words about virtue and disgust. And these clusters would represent these underlying foundations or dimensions of morality. This is a prediction that moral foundations dimension would make, a moral foundations theory. What we did in our study is we looked at this semantic space over time. We looked at books that were published in different corpora, and we mapped out whether that we did see this clustering pattern and whether over time these clusters have become less pronounced, which would be consistent with a collapse of the moral semantic space and an emergence of generalized morality. We did this using pre-trained word embeddings models in the HistWords dataset, which were first tested in the English all corpus of the Ngram, Google Ngram project, and then were replicated in specifically the fiction corpus. So we didn't have any changes in the content of the books, because one concern would be that the proliferation of self-published books and scientific literature might be affecting these results. We saw the same effect in the Ngram and fiction corpus, so I'm going to focus on the larger Ngram corpus here. We looked at the words that you see on this slide, which were sampled from the Moral Foundation's Luke Dictionary. And we looked at similarity in meaning using cosine similarity of pairs of words, where a cosine similarity approaching 1 suggests that 2 words are semantically redundant in an embeddings framework, and a cosine similarity approaching 0 suggests that 2 words are unrelated. What we found is that over time, the cosine similarity of all these words is going up. And so all these words are becoming more semantically redundant with each other. But what we were specifically focused on was words that were from the different foundations, the different dimensions, showing that these modules were clustering, these clusters were collapsing. And this is what we found. At the beginning, if words belong to the same foundation, they were much more different, much more similar than words belonging to different foundations. And this difference persisted over time, but it had shrunk by about 50% by the end of the time period. And the interaction between time and whether 2 words belong to the same foundation was statistically significant. This is actually the embeddings from the dataset collapsed onto a 2-dimensional space using a TSNE algorithm. And what you see here is that the difference between these clusters, the clusters are colored using the same colors, is much less pronounced when you skip forward from 1800 to 1810 all the way to 1990 to 2000. And importantly, we don't see this for other corpora, for other dictionaries. So for example, when we look at emotion words, these stay very granular, very distinct over time. It doesn't show the same collapsing pattern as morality. And so this comes from a different analysis that I've done of emotion words from 1800 to 2000, and they've remained much more granular. So all in all, it's consistent with this theory that generalized morality is spreading as social networks are getting larger. And this paper is about to come out in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And so you can read about a few more of our studies, including some of the modeling work that we did. I want to transition, though, to the second part of this talk, which is this argument that generalized morality doesn't solve all the problems of living in large social networks. In addition to individual people trying to figure out who to trust using moral traits, we are also trying to maintain trust in our entire society. You need people to feel like they owe something to their society, and they trust people in their society, and they have an attachment to their social network, for them to vote, support military endeavors, and subscribe in drafts, and also to have faith in their judicial system. And there's a legitimate concern among evolutionary anthropologists and biologists that as societies get bigger, it's very easy to imagine that these systems of trust would fall apart because people have no personal obligation to these social institutions and to each other. They're mostly just living in societies of anonymous strangers. And this takes me to the second part of my talk, and the importance of religion. And so I'm going to speak about some of the work that my colleagues have done on how religion has become more and more moralized as a way of promoting trust in large, complex societies. Again, we approach this work from an evolutionary perspective, that there's this parallel between the adaptiveness, the way that biology adapts to novel circumstances, and the way that culture adapts. And I always like to point out one specific way that religion has adapted that's very similar to biology. And so in biology, one thing that you see is that insects have very long and narrow bodies. This is actually so that oxygen can reach their internal organs through exoskeletons. If insects were very wide and large, oxygen wouldn't be able to penetrate to the middle of their body. And so this is why they're long and narrow, so oxygen can reach the middle of their body at every point. It's actually something else that you see in cathedrals. Cathedrals are always long and narrow, and it's because before electricity, they needed light to get to the middle of the cathedral. And so they adapted in the same way that insects had with these long and narrow structures. Apart from architecture, I argue in a lot of work that religious beliefs have also involved a suite of cultural adaptations. For example, they have visible cues and costly signals that show that people are trustworthy members of the community. Religions make it very easy to pick out who's part of that religion and who has actually sacrificed to be part of that religion, so that you know who to trust as a group member. The analysis that you see on the right here is from a colleague of mine named Rich Sosis. And what he showed was that in the first 100 years of communes in America, in the Transcendentalist period, communes that had a religious origin lasted significantly longer than communes that had a secular origin. They were able to last a lot longer before everyone died out or gave up on the commune. And he argues that it's because of this trust. You knew who was part of your group and you had more things in common with them. The social identity was stronger. In addition to offering these signals of social identity and trustworthiness, religion also can be moralized. You can think that God cares about your moral behavior and has a lot to say about your violation of moral norms. The figure that you see on this slide comes from a paper called Supernatural Norm Enforcement. And what they did in this paper is they had people participate in an economic game, and they would see how much money people would give away. And then they would put some people in a condition where they would say, before you make this decision, think about what God would want you to do. Or before you make this decision, think about what karma would want you to do. And they found that after these God or karma primes, people would give a significantly greater amount of money away. And it's this idea that if God or some supernatural agent is watching you, then you should be a better person. What we've argued is that these moralizing religious beliefs, this idea of a punitive religious agent who's watching you, has actually been very important for the emergence of strong norms, especially in communities that didn't have police forces or governments that could watch people. And that you can see religion changing to become more moralized in places where this is very important, like after natural disasters, where cooperation is very difficult to maintain because people's lives have been turned upside down, or during conflict where you need people to cooperate to enroll in drafts or to follow rations, or when societies get so big that they can't maintain cooperation by everyone watching each other all the time, like in the case of social complexity, when cooperation could fall apart because we're in communities of relative strangers. And in each of these contexts, you see religion becoming more and more moral. I'll give you a few examples from our studies. This was a study where we looked across the United States and looked at regions that had higher or lower rates of natural disasters throughout history. What we found is that there was significant variation in the level of natural disasters across US regions, and you can predict the prevalence of hell today, hell belief, based on these histories of natural disasters. And crucially, this is adjusting for how religious people are in these regions. This is looking at hell belief residualized on religiosity. And so it's not just that people are getting more religious after natural disasters, it's that specifically they believe in supernatural punishment. You also see this during the rise of social complexity. This is a paper that my colleagues and I just had come out in Nature Human Behavior. It was Danica Wilbanks and I co-first authored this paper. She was really instrumental in getting this project done. What we did for this project is we looked through the ethnographic and historical material for 114 different societies. And we looked at the kinds of supernatural explanations that people made in these societies. So what kinds of things they would explain using their religious beliefs. So I want to just draw your attention to a couple of different kinds of supernatural explanations. This is a group in South America, a hunter-gatherer group that's explaining lightning, through a weapon carried by the thunder spirit. It's maintained by some that thunder strikes and kills people with the sword that this god carries. So this is not a moralized supernatural explanation. It's dealing with something in the natural world. This second kind of supernatural explanation, though, is about really about morality. It's this idea that some people in society make a devil's pact with a spirit called a tujul, and through this devil's pact, they can get wealthy or become famous. But that anyone who makes this devil's pact and who becomes famous through ill-gotten gains will have a slow and painful death. They're going to have a continued pain and prolonged high fever, which is the other side of making this pact. We teased out these two kinds of explanations of things that happen in the natural world and explanations of why someone might get sick or die for moral reasons. And what we found is that as societies get more and more socially complex, as groups move from hunter-gatherers and horticulturalist societies to very populous urbanized groups, the prevalence of nature-focused explanations remains quite high. It decreases very marginally. But the prevalence of these explanations that focus on the social and the moral themes gets significantly higher, by about 20% of societies. And the real effect that's driving this is population size. So it's in the really large anonymous societies where socially focused supernatural explanations are becoming most prevalent. We've actually shown the same thing over time during conflicts. So during conflicts, we're able to actually see religious beliefs change to become more about supernatural norm enforcement. This is a study that we did by extracting Bible passages from large corpora using a Google Books corpus. And we developed tags like Psalm 136. These linguistic tags were associated with loving Bible chapters where God was very nice to people. And then we also looked at tags associated with punitive Bible chapters where God punishes people. We next merged these rates of Bible chapter citation with data on conflict over the 20th century from a resource called the Conflict Catalog. So what you see here is the prevalence of Bible citations over time from punitive Bible chapters. And what you can see is two very pronounced spikes where people begin citing passages where God is punishing people during each of the two world wars. Whereas there's just this general upward trend in people's tendency to cite passages where God behaves in a loving way or a forgiving way. We also formally matched these rates of frequency with conflict and found that conflict significantly correlates with the rate of punitive but not loving Bible chapter citations. And this is a lagged correlation. So it's conflict that comes first, and then punitive Bible chapter citations come second. And you can see that through the magnitude of these bars, which is highest in the years following conflict. Every one of these bars is a lagged correlation. And what we think is that this shows that religious beliefs are adapting to contexts where cooperation is especially important, both social complexity, but also times of threat, where it's very important for a group to cooperate and to trust the institutions in that group. And that along with generalized morality, these have been mechanisms to maintain trust and cooperation in complex societies. But I promised this 2.5, which is about the moralization of other kinds of institutions. And so I'll briefly touch on that before I wrap things up for today. And I think that this is a really interesting and quite novel set of trends. And I think that it has something to do with religious decline. Now, religion isn't declining everywhere, but it's declining in a lot of places. So this is America, for example, which is actually one of the more religious Western countries. And what you see here is that the percentage of the population who are Protestant has dropped by about 10% over the last 13 or so years. And the same thing's happening with Catholics, whereas people who identify as none and people who identify as atheist or agnostic are getting more numerous. And there have been books and papers on why this has happened. I actually have done some work on this myself that just came out a couple of weeks ago, showing that the rise of AI has actually precipitated some of these religious declines in some places. But for today, I'm going to speak a little bit less about the cause of religious decline and a little more about the consequence. One thing that I think could be an outcome of religious decline is declining trust. Like I mentioned, religion is very consistently associated with trust, both because it provides signals of group identity to people, but also because it actually deliberately elicits trust through fear of supernatural punishment. And during the same time that religion has declined, and in the same countries, you see declines in belief that people around you can be trusted. So this is within the United States, and this is within Soviet bloc countries following religious deconversion. But the other factor that I think is arising from the decline of religion is a transformation of cultural institutions that have traditionally not been as moralized as religiosity. And institutions relating to national identity and politics could be turning into more moral tribes to an extent that they weren't before. The first of these trends that I think might be related to this decline is the moralization of politics. During the same time that religion has declined, there's been an increase in language around almost every dimension of morality among politicians. The data source that I'm showing you here is from a psychological science study that was done by analyzing speeches from Congress people over the last few Congresses. And they show that there's been a considerable rise in moral language across these speeches. And so for whatever reason, and potentially because religion is declining, politics is becoming more and more of a moral institution. I think another really interesting, more recent trend in moral transformation is the moralization and also polarization of national and regional identity. I'll walk you through the graphs that I'm showing here. The items that you see at the top are items that are included in the World Values Survey, which is a large survey of people across over 100 countries that have participated over the years. What I've done here is I've taken the country means for 76 countries that participated in multiple waves of the World Values Survey. And then I've taken the standard deviation across those means. A higher standard deviation means that cultures disagree more on these items. And a lower standard deviation means they disagree less. Their means are more similar. What you see is that over the last 45 years, from the first to the 7th time point of the World Values Survey, the standard deviation of cultural beliefs about these moral values has nearly doubled across all of these values. And it's this nonlinear trend where the largest changes happened between 1980 and 2010. And you can see this polarization if you just look at the means by continent. So these are the means of these things that I call emancipative values, which are responses to these moral questions here about whether it's justifiable to live these kind of non-normative lifestyles. And what you see here is that Oceania, North America, Europe, and South America have all branched upward over time, whereas Asia and Africa have remained quite similar. And what this has created is a worldwide polarization of values over the last 45 years. And you can see this if you map out all the values in the World Values Survey using a principal components analysis. It looks like this, where these weird countries are especially weird in the seventh wave of the World Values Survey. And if you look at the website of the World Values Survey, you can actually see this divergence happening because they publish these maps of cultural differences for every time point. Here you can see the map for the 5th time point, and you can see they've carved out these different regions of values based on the countries that compose them. So here are the English-speaking countries, Protestant Europe, but they're all kind of in the same cluster. 20 years later, by the 7th wave of the World Values Survey, you can see the edges of these clusters pulling apart, which is exactly the value divergence that my colleagues and I have found. And when you look at what values are driving this divergence, it's these moral values. The more moral a value is when we norm it, the more it's better able to predict whether the value is culturally polarized over the last 45 years or whether it's homogenized, converged. And so I think that there's this fascinating third problem here, which is that we've had these adaptations to social complexity over the last several hundred years, but now we're seeing new adaptations in the transformation of politics and national identity that could foreshadow global conflict in a way that we haven't had before. I'd like to leave you with one thought here as I wrap up this presentation, which is speculation that population geneticists have made about the future of the world's population. What they've predicted is that over the next 100 years, the world's population will grow, but it will begin to plateau, and it might even begin to decline. And I'm going to pre-register a prediction about what this change in population will mean over the course of human history. That one route that humanity could take is that we are at a kind of apex of social complexity, that our technological innovations that we've seen and the rise in the size of our communities is about to slow down and perhaps even reverse, and that along with it, our moral polarization may also go down. The other route, and I think an equally plausible route, is that our history continues along the trajectory that it's always continued along, that our groups get more complex, our societies get bigger, our technology continues to bring us into contact with more and more people we don't know, that we get further and further away from the life of my great-grandfather and closer to the life that I lead now. And in this world, I think that moral psychology is going to continue to become simpler, more generalized, and more polarized. And so we'll have to find out which of those takes place. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jackson, for very interesting presentation, and also very insightful. So now is Q&A. So okay, Jacob, you can raise your hands or type your question in the chat box. Okay, Jacob, go ahead.
Yeah. So I kept thinking more on a micro meso level about what you're saying. I think it's true at the macro level, but like thinking of like a social network analyst, I would think that there would still be some heterogeneity within like meso level institutions and micro level institutions in terms of cliques and structural holes between those cliques, and kind of how central actors are in a given network, how much they have a brokerage role, maybe between two networks, because that would modify the amount of information they would need about different unknown people and unknown unknowns and knowns about different individuals in their social network. And so, I mean, this isn't just to muddy your thesis, but I think there could be more lower level research into how these dynamics with the heuristics of morality kind of operate. And that could, you know, from a policy point of view, if we're thinking about dealing things like with crime and like deviance and that sort of thing, it seems like it would be useful in establishing trust. But I agree with your point that like on a larger macro level, as societies become more complex, I just imagine what Emil Durkheim would make up like a lot of this. Real field day from mechanical to organic solidarity to this and his concerns about morality. But anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that you can pretty much draw a straight line from Emil Durkheim to a lot of the conversations we're having right now. And I absolutely agree with your point. I have a colleague who studies what I call meta technologies, which are technologies that help people deal with technologies. So, you know, for example, I think that a social meta technology is the role of the manager. It's not something that existed for most of human history. We didn't have managers in our organizations. You had a blacksmith and an apprentice. But now we have these choke points where information passes through and then it gets distributed across the network. The idea of this broker that you brought up. And so we're doing a review paper now on social meta technologies, basically positions or roles or occupations that have been created so that information can move more efficiently across networks, but also so this anonymity problem comes up much less frequently. And so, I didn't get into that today because it's still quite new work, but I think there are ways of mitigating some of the issues that I've discussed today. And I think you're absolutely right. Another point that I'll add related to the kind of meso level is that although I didn't really have time to get into the guts of this study, one thing that we see is that while values have converged at the global level, they've actually converged at the regional level. Regions have become more alike over time, and there's been greater trust between countries within regions that have different cultural histories. So Japan and China is a good example of that. And you can also see this in the formation of international trade organizations over the last 50 years. These organizations have increasingly involved regional blocks of countries and much less so countries that have different cultural histories or are geographically distant. And so, I think that there's some nuance here that I didn't quite capture that you're pointing out, and I agree with.
Okay, Professor Tan, Tony.
Hi, Joshua. Wonderful research program. It's fascinating indeed. There are a lot of points covered. One of the points I want to ask for your clarification is the following. One of your key hypotheses is about adaptive heuristic. You interpreted, you proposed using this concept to anchor the explanatory hypothesis that generalized morality would emerge or strengthen in a community the heavier the information load, cognitive information load you expect from larger network, more complex society, and so on. What do you attach to this concept of heuristic that will give you the explanatory leverage? That is something in our mind. When you call it an adaptive heuristic, we've got to be able to so-called test it empirically. You use this term to interpret the correlations, and sometimes maybe even natural experiments. But it's at the end of the day, this is just a label. What do you put to this concept that can give you extra leverage in explaining the connection between generalized morality in the rising general use of a generalized morality in a community and increasing information load? Can you clarify on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad that I get to dig into it a little bit more, actually. And so the way that Gigerenzer speaks about heuristics is their psychological processes that ignore information. You're intentionally oversimplifying the world. You're making a decision that is a generalized model that isn't an algorithm. It isn't representing all the details of the world. And so, when I make this decision, when I average across all of these situations with a single label, a single category, I'm ignoring information about the true variation in the world. I'm ignoring information. I'm ignoring the fact that this person is brave, but also selfish when it comes to charitable giving. And so, this idea of ignoring information is really a key part of how we formally define the term. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in some of the studies I didn't get to speak about. And so what we find in this agent-based model is that we allow agents aggregate to some degree across the situations that they've seen their partners in. And so, and what we find is that as social networks get larger, the agents that aggregate information, even though they're intentionally blurring real variation in cooperative behavior, are those that are better able to succeed in repeated trust games. And this is because when you aggregate information, you are opening yourself up to making occasional erroneous decisions, making false predictions, like, for example, making the prediction that this person will be charitable when they're really selfish. But when you don't aggregate information, when you try to represent the world exactly as you know it without making any assumptions, then in these situations which are gray, you don't have any priors. And so you have to make guesses. And basically the predictive power that these generalized aggregations buy you outweigh the power of the specificity when the volume of the guesses is high. And we do the same thing in a laboratory study, where we have people play real economic games with partners they allow to interact many, many times, or they interact almost no times. What we find is that when real people use very simplified moral labels to make predictions of trust, they perform better than those that use more complex labels when they have very little information about their partners, but they make worse predictions when they have a lot of information about their partners. So we do think that there's an adaptive component to this. I'll close the response by saying that I don't think that's the whole story. I think that what we're seeing here is really a convergence of both what's appealing and intuitive in large groups. Like from a construal level perspective in psychology, you would imagine that when you don't know someone very well, it's more appealing and intuitive to make an abstract representation of that person. But I think that this is also an adaptive strategy. And so we're really seeing the convergence of those two different proximal and ultimate explanations.
It's actually quite paradoxical, isn't it? The payoff to using this simplified heuristic works better in a larger network than in a smaller network, simpler network. Is counterintuitive to me, actually, because in a simple world, in a village, everybody knows everybody. A small world, we know everything. Wouldn't it be more natural for us to adopt a simplistic model, heuristic, to make correlations behavior in the traditional world they're kind of familiar with? But in the modern world, we are much more unable to predict. That's the real life. In real life, we are less able to predict. How come I would adopt a more simplistic heuristic in a complex setting?
You would think that being faced with the complexity of our world, we would learn, but it doesn't seem to be the case. I'll give you one example from some field work that an anthropologist colleague of mine did. Guy named Clark Barrett, who's a quantitative anthropologist. And along with some colleagues of his, he was doing field work in the Pacific, looking at something called opacity of mind. And this is the idea that you can't ever assume what someone's intentions are or what someone's character is based on their behavior. You can only make judgments about whether behavior is good and bad. And what he finds is that when you give people moral dilemmas where someone does a wrong intentionally or unintentionally, people see the act as equally bad because the idea of intention is not used in that society. I think that that's actually very related to this. When we make a judgment about intentionality, what we're doing is we're reaching beyond behavior to say, is this a good person or a bad person? Did they mean to do this bad thing or did they not mean? And you don't really need to do that if you see someone all the time, when you see how they behave all the time. When we can make predictions based on behavior, we don't need to abstract beyond those behaviors to decide whether someone's a good or a bad person. It's only really, those abstractions are only really helpful when we need to make predictions about someone in a context we haven't seen them behave before many times.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, we have a other question from urbanism perspective. Okay, so Eric.
Hello. Yes, so my general area is that of urbanism, as I mentioned. I thought this presentation was really fascinating, perhaps because I don't know as much about that field, but a couple of things that you mentioned struck me as having parallels within this kind of urbanism context. One was you're evoking language when you spoke about Darwinism and some of the sort of survivalism of different words in a kind of evolutionary linguistic context. And that brought to mind Zipf, ZIPF. I don't know if that name rings a bell in other fields, but Zipf was a Harvard professor in the mid 20th century who, without the benefit of modern computers, looked at the occurrence of words in everyday text and found that there was this negative exponential relationship that came out very clearly in sort of the most frequent word and how often that was used to the second most frequent word and the third most frequent word, etc. And that became known as sort of Zipf's law. But in his book, which I think was published in 1949, he also looked at population of urban areas. And the same phenomenon occurred, that within cities, within countries, one looks at the population of the largest urban area and then the second largest urban area, third largest urban area, etc. There was this remarkable regularity in the patterns and frequencies that occurred. And it's sort of astonishing in the context of language, or astonishing in the context of city population size. But the fact that this Zipf's law would appear in such varied domains, and I think there were 9 different domains that he looked at in his book, but those are the 2 that come to mind. So I'm just wondering whether there's some kind of underlying regularity. I know that urbanists have looked at this in the context of kind of statistical probabilities, I'm afraid I don't know that work enough that I could go into the detail, but still it's a phenomenon that's remarkable. And I'm wondering if there are some parallels in the context that you're working in. And then on a similar point, and sorry to go on, but on a kind of similar point, just in the context of urbanism, some of the work that I've looked at looks at how variation in characteristics, social characteristics of population varies in terms of urban structure. And I'm in Hong Kong now, but I'm based normally in Los Angeles. And I've looked at a kind of comparison between Los Angeles and Taipei. This was some while ago that I looked at. But in Los Angeles, a very large metropolitan area, what we find is a very, very strong kind of tendency for similar people who are similar by virtue of a whole array of socioeconomic characteristics to group together in geographical spaces that are jurisdictions. And this is a kind of phenomenon that we attribute to Charles Debut, whose centennial is coming up next year. Whereas in places like Taipei, what we find is that there is a similar diversity, but it's within a micro scale. It's like scooping up, I use the analogy of scooping up a bit of sand from the beach, that even in a small sample, small granular sample, you get tremendous diversity, but it's not as though the little grains of one color all in one space and another color all in another space. They're kind of intermixed. And so what drives this sort of diversity within larger scales or smaller scales is quite fascinating. So whether those are related or not to what you're discussing, those are nonetheless ideas that sort of popped into my mind. So I thought I'd toss them back at you, see if you had some reflection on that. Thank you.
Yeah, two really excellent questions. The first one I have a quite short answer for, and then the second one maybe a quite slightly longer answer. So the first is that Zipf's law is fascinating. I think it's, defies the logic. My colleagues and I are right now analyzing a large data set called A Brief History of Human Time. So a data set which is scraped from Wikidata of notable people over human history. It contains a little over, I think, 1.2 million people. And You get their metadata about their occupation, where they were born, where they died, how long they lived, and all the people they're associated with based on the URLs that come on their Wikipedia page. What we're doing with this data set is looking at the coevolution of occupations, but also the rise and fall of different occupations depending on the demands of the culture. And one thing that you see is that Zipf's law characterizes the occupations the most prevalent, the second most prevalent, the third most prevalent, looks almost identical to any of the other contexts in which you see the law. So one more case in point. With respect to what you found with Taipei and LA, that's consistent with a growing literature in my area of cultural psychology on relational mobility, which is how easily you can break ties and move to new parts of your network. And there are differences in relational mobility around the world. And the United States tends to be quite high on relational mobility, whereas most East Asian countries tend to be much lower because of the legacy of history of Confucianism and collectivism and the different values of the culture. Now, for a long time, there wasn't really a good explanation of why there were these group differences in relational mobility. Now there are a few. One explanation is differences in subsistence styles, that early irrigation practices in East Asia were more, or early agricultural practices were more irrigation heavy. So they required the coordination of larger numbers of people. So there emerged this, norm that you had to form these tighter networks of mutual cooperation. That's work done by my colleague here at Booth, actually, Thomas Talhelm. Another explanation that I think is really provocative is that changes in the church structure in Europe during the medieval period prevented marriages between cousins. And what this meant is that social networks got more heterogeneous, and it became more normative to leave your family context, your kinship context, and to go marry a total stranger. And that this may foreshadow a large set of cultural differences between the East and the West in individualism and generalized trust, and also relational mobility. And so some of the historical underpinnings perhaps behind what you found in urbanism.
Okay. Professor Tan, you have another question?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
follow up with another question on my mind. When you discuss the Darwinian theory of evolution, you emphasize the adaptive process, adaptation mechanism. There is, of course, the other side of the evolutionary determinant, that is the environmental selection. Your story is basically focused on the adaptive side, and your evidence are quite convincing on that. What do you think about the possibility of environmental selection when environment includes social institution? When we interpreting the polarizing world and so on, sociologists and political scientists tend to think agency is part of it, but then the institutional context is another part of it. What is your thinking about that?
That's it's a great question. I don't know if I'll have a ready-made answer for you. What I will say is that, the evidence has been, since the talk that I'm giving is primarily from an adaptive perspective, I was presenting evidence that was helping, lay out that perspective a little more clearly. One of the unique properties of cultural evolution is that it has a larger number of maladaptive properties compared to biological evolution, because it's easier for sets of traits to co-evolve or to drift together to the point that something that is less adaptive can co-evolve with something that's adaptive. So for example, it may be important for to have political identities that you can use to navigate trust in an environment, but the specific beliefs of those political identities can become quite maladaptive, because as a kind of side effect of trying to delineate moral identity using politics. One case of a kind of environmentally selected for maladaptive trend that my colleagues and I discuss is social media. And so social media is, what's unique about social media information environments is that most of the information on those environments has been curated by algorithms. And algorithms are blind to the specific content that they feed you. They only want to feed you content that is going to keep you on the platform so that it can maximize advertising revenue. The problem with that is that humans have biases towards certain information that we have maybe biologically evolved for very different reasons, like a bias towards threat, to moral outrage, and to defective behavior, a bias towards negativity. And these may, on average, help direct us to problems in our environment. But what happens when algorithms try to keep you on a platform is that they're going to feed you a heavy recipe of that kind of information, because it's the stuff that people will click on and will comment on and will retweet. And what we show is that the rise of negative and moralized information on social media is directly responsible for a lot of misperceptions that people have about polarization in their society. And so a lot of Americans actually think that liberals and conservatives are further apart than they really are on a whole host of policy issues. And that's driven the rise in affective polarization among American partisans over the last 40 years. And we think that social media is perhaps responsible for that because of the kind of information that it promotes. It's information that's selected for by our minds, not necessarily adaptive on a macro group level.
I think your comment about at the beginning of your response, you did draw the distinction between biological traits and cultural traits. There's a very influential theory within sociology, cultural sociology, that culture is like a toolkit. We always have a toolkit of different so-called cultural repertoires that get selected, activated, and become elevated to a prominence, dominant strategy of behavior and so on, depending on the environment, the larger historical environment. And we can have all these repertoires floating around in our pocket without causing survival problem. If we can activate them. So it's a distinction from genetically coded traits in biology that can draw a distinction between cultural evolution and biological evolution. You may consider that as a relevant factor to consider in your future work.
Yeah, I'll have to reach out to you offline and read some of that work myself before making any strong claims about it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the audience, especially our CSS fellows? Don't be shy. So if you don't have a immediate questions, I will ask my own questions. Okay, so this is about a methodological that you're using a lot of. Actually, many of your study using language and natural language procession to study the evolution of a culture. So then what you just mentioned is that you use the pre-trained word embedding models, and you find that there is a converging trend about the different moral attributes. So my question is about actually it's another possibility, okay, alternative explanation. So the change probably is not as psychological, but probably influenced like by the mass media, because I'm a media scholar, so that's I naturally think in that way. So like the influence of mass media, the popularity of mass media. So like the dominant the use of the language is everyone else that probably will be influenced by the mass media to use those languages in certain ways. So that's why probably you will see the convergent trend. So probably this is you can also interpret it that this is a kind of a psychological process that the influence is real. So the problem is now, okay, it's become more complicated because of the so-called large language models like ChatGPT. So a lot of language not produced by human, but by the machines. And
Yeah.
you can imagine that in the past, that is the diversity of the language you use, that you can expect that because there are like different variations. But the machines, I don't believe there is so much variation, okay, like in ChatGPT. So this is probably you will find that the language you use will be more similar to each other, and you will find that the moral attributes or many other psychological attributes will be the related words that will be more similar to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So great questions. I think there are kind of two questions there. There's first of all, what's the cause and what's the outcome in these historical processes? And then there's the question of what will happen when large language models have a greater say over language production, and what happens when we start reading information generated by these models instead of information generated by each other. Both great questions. The first question, I mean, a lot of this work, when you talk about mass media, you're talking about a changing beast, and you probably know a lot more about this than I do. A lot of the work that I'm doing is looking at linguistic trends that come before people begin watching television or sharing information on social media. And so, I mean, the way that I've interpreted these trends is that they reflect the preferences and the attitudes of the people in the societies that are producing these trends, that are producing these books. And I'm not sure if that's consistent or inconsistent with what you're suggesting, but I think that saying that this is caused by mass media is kind of like pushing the question back a level. Then why is mass media creating a market for these sort of preferences? And so perhaps we actually agree. With respect to your second question about large language models, I think it's a really brilliant question. And I have so much to say about it. I'll say for now that one thing that I think is a big open question is whether large language models are going to be kind of a hegemonizing force, whether they are going to be hegemonic based on Western values and attitudes. The companies that are developing these models are going to impose their own stereotypes and assumptions about the world onto the models that they train, or whether these are going to reproduce, cultural values, stereotypes that we've had historically in our groups. And so CY actually has this line of work showing that you can prime culture based on language. When you ask a question to a bicultural person in Chinese versus English, you can actually elicit different kinds of values. So right now, my student Wanzi Li is doing a study where he is priming ChatGPT by asking it questions in different languages and seeing whether the responses it gives back, whether the content of those responses is prototypical to the culture that's associated with the language that asked the question, or whether it's only reflecting Western values. And I think that, the results of that project are going to have big implications for whether large language models become a force of cultural homogenization, or whether they just become one more force driving divergence across cultures. I think there's also the next step of, what happens when these models begin getting developed by tech companies within the culture. These companies have a lot of say over the moral attitudes of large language models. OpenAI has decided what ChatGPT's moral stance is on gender equality, racial equality, a whole host of moral issues. And are these large language models going to begin reflecting the moral sentiments of the people in the countries that develop them? And if that's the case, are they going to kind of create more entrenched cultural differences? I'm not sure. I don't have the answer to a lot of these questions, but I can begin answering them in a few months when some of our results begin coming back.
It's good to know that you're working on this project. Okay, I'm really looking forward to your results.
I am too. I don't know what I'll find.
Okay. Any other questions?
I'll add that if you do have a question for me, but you don't want to ask it in a big group, then feel free to send me an email and I'll try to provide a thoughtful reply.
So if there's no more questions, and I guess that our time is almost there. So thank you, Professor Jackson. Thank you again. So it's a really wonderful talk. So and as the students, don't be shy to send the email your questions to Professor Jackson.
Thank you, Joshua.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for the question. Thank you, everyone.